Ahead and start by welcoming everyone to another of the CBEY, or the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, author talk series. I'm Indy Burke. I'm the Dean of the Yale School of the Environment, and we co-house CBEY along with the School of Management. CBEY's author talk series is designed to focus on deep dives into critical topics through timely new books. And these are thoughtful conversations with experts to get right at the matter at hand and talk about where we go from here. And it's really exciting to have questions from the audience to round out the conversations and add different perspectives. This talk today is really special for our community in the School of the Environment because it pairs one of our recent graduates with author and sustainability leader Vincent Stanley, who was an inspiration for this series. The topic for today's talk is Love for the Land, Lessons of Farmers Who Persist in Place, written by Brooks Lamb. The book is a really moving exploration of presence and place, and it's told through stories of small and mid-sized farmers who keep and tend their land in the face of what appears to be overwhelming adversity. So many of these small farmers remain attached to and steward their land through generations, even though they're pressured by suburban expansion, the growth of big agriculture, and the temptation to sell at major prices, and the really low financial rewards of farming and burdens of hard daily work. Why do they hang on, and what can they teach us? In his own words from the preface, the author Brooks Lamb, who's here with us, writes, "Against market forces, hostile policy, and contrary conventional wisdom, small farmers won't get big and they won't go out. Imagination, affection, and fidelity help explain why." Brooks interviewed farmers in rural areas that are undergoing change, and he writes about this in Love for the Land to shed light on the virtues that farmers have in the face of so many challenges. He also very interestingly explores the role that racism has played in challenging Black farmers who steward their land against even more kinds of adversity. The book has so many implications for other kinds of environmental and social stewardship, and I know you're going to enjoy hearing about it. Let me say a few words about the author of Love for the Land, my friend Brooks Lamb, a recent alumnus of our school, the Yale School of the Environment. Brooks grew up on a small farm in Holt's Corner, Tennessee, and I think he'll be telling us about Holt's Corner today. That was the source of his inspiration, and where he says he learned to cultivate a strong work ethic and understanding of hope and commitment to community. He made a really immediate impression on me here at our school, where he brought all of this genuine rural nature and charm and humility to us here in New Haven. He was extremely dedicated to his field work and coursework, even in the face of the pandemic, which is how he ended his time here, was mid-pandemic. And he made many friends among the students and faculty. He also won an award, the Strawn Donnelly Award, for his interdisciplinary writing for his thesis. Brooks now works for the American Farmland Trust in Memphis. And I should also say, since today this news came out of embargo, the book Love for the Land has just been named as one of the finalists for the Reed Environmental Writing Award from the Southern Environmental Law Center. And it sounds like final awards will be announced in February 2024. So congratulations on that, Brooks. Our facilitator today is Vincent Stanley, the inspiration for Authors Talks. He's a CBEY resident fellow and the director of philosophy at Patagonia. Vincent has many contributions to environmental thought and business ethics. He's the recent co-author of The Responsible Company, newly released this past September, and he's committed to supporting and mentoring students across Yale over the past decade. So let me encourage the audience to actively participate in the discussion. You can ask questions via the Q&A function. I think you can actually also use the chat button. And we in our school and CBEY really value thoughtful and extended dialogue as we talk about some of these really important environmental and social challenges. So many thanks to Brooks and Vincent for joining us all today. And Vincent, let me hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Indy, for the really wonderful précis of the book. And Brooks, I'm very glad to be with you today. I wanted to start out by asking you, first of all, I want to just make sure that we've got, Brooks, do we have your picture online?
I believe so. I think we're
There
good.
you go. Okay. All right. I was looking at a chess pawn and now I'm looking at Brooks on the left. That's a lot better. I wanted to ask you how, Indy gave some background about where you came from, how you came to Yale. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you came to write this book. And particularly, I was really taken. It's almost like a symphony. The major key of this book seems to be to return time and again to these three qualities of imagination, affection, and fidelity as the necessary qualities for persisting in a place and also persisting in the love of a place. So I wanted to ask you, how did you come to write the book? What inspired you, and what kept you going through the process of writing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to thank the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale for hosting this conversation. When Heather and Stu first reached out to me a few months ago and asked about this, I was immediately very excited, having watched the author talks before, and just really, really grateful to get to be a part of this series. Also want to thank everybody who's here today. I know everybody's either on their lunch hour, or if they're on the West Coast, they might be still working on their first cup of coffee, but really appreciate y'all joining in today. In terms of what really inspired me to write the book, I graduated from college in the spring of 2017. I went to a small, really, really wonderful college in Memphis called Rhodes College. And when I graduated, I had a few different opportunities that I could pursue, some of which were really exciting and would have taken me to some really interesting faraway places. Instead of pursuing some of those other opportunities, I decided to stay home and work in my home state of Tennessee. And I went to work for a nonprofit organization called the Land Trust for Tennessee. So they're a statewide conservation group that really works on protecting land, whether it's a forest or a farm or a park, whatever it may be, from haphazard development. So keeping those open spaces from transforming into subdivisions or strip malls or warehouses, whatever it may be. They have a few different tools for accomplishing that. The one that we most often used was called a conservation easement, which is essentially a legal agreement that permanently severs the development rights from a property, so that space will always be a farm or a forest or whatever the use is. Sometimes folks can take tax deductions for placing a conservation easement on their land, but if they don't have a lot of income, it's not something that they often tend to do. And that was the case for a lot of the folks that I spoke with through my work. So I worked as the rural conservation manager for the Land Trust for Tennessee. And I found myself traveling all across the state and talking mostly with farmers about permanently protecting their land. And we would have conversations in feed stores and on truck tailgates and in fields about what was driving their interest in permanently conserving their farms. And for a lot of these farmers, again, they didn't get any financial benefit whatsoever from doing this. They actually took quite a big financial hit because they are permanently reducing what they could sell their land for in the future should it come to that, because they can't sell it for top dollar for what society calls highest and best use of their land, because the land is restricted in terms of its development potential. So I had conversations with these folks about why they were thinking about doing this. And time again, they spoke about their relationships with the land, how they grew up on these farms in some instances, or how they moved there and really became connected to these places, and how they had fostered this sense of love for the land, for farming. And that love wasn't just driving their interest in potentially placing a conservation easement on their farms. It was driving their perseverance in general, because as we'll probably talk about later on, smaller scale farming is not typically a lucrative vocation in the US, because of the way that policy and other forces have positioned our agricultural system. And so they are persisting in place and caring for their land because of their love for it. And I really found that to be inspiring. And while it was inspiring, it also wasn't, for me personally, necessarily surprising. So as Indy mentioned, I grew up on a small farm in rural Tennessee in Marshall County, about 50 miles south of Nashville. And I learned that same love for the land, that same commitment to place, from my parents and from my older brothers and from aunts and uncles and grandparents who had come out and worked the farm with us, and in the process teach me and others what that really meant, not just from a food production standpoint, but from really a spiritual standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from all of these different perspectives. And so, I worked 2 years having these conversations with the land folks who were interested in the land trust for Tennessee, and really just saw this thread connecting all these people from different areas with different political views and even different religious backgrounds and all these different things, this thread that was connecting them together. And I really wanted to tug on that thread and ask the questions about why these people were sometimes practicing self-sacrificial stewardship, as I call it in the book. And so thankfully, the school of the environment gave me that chance to come and ask these questions and explore these issues and these ideas, both in the classroom and through field work. And really, my thesis at the school of the environment became the foundation of this book. And so in some ways, I've been writing this book all my life. And in other ways, it's been a more recent development, but I think through these ideas and these experiences and how they've shaped the people in this book, but also shaped myself. And I really do genuinely believe that all of us, whether we live on farms or whether we live in big cities, have a lot to learn from those who connect with, commit to, and then continuously love specific places on Earth.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting when you go back and the way we talked during the pandemic, is people weren't going to offices, and I remember I felt it here in Santa Barbara that the natural world had opened up a little bit. That it's like the plants were happier, the animals were coming in closer, and there was a stronger sense of place. One of the things that interests me, or kind of delighted me about reading your book, is to see where that sense of place is so much stronger than we might experience it in town, even during the pandemic. There are a couple of just very quick stories I wish you tell about this connection to place. One involved a character, I think it was Samuel, and one involving yourself. And you spoke, it was a very moving paragraph about caring for animals in winter and how that connected you to the experience. And then the other was about Samuel and having his kids hang out while he was working, even though they might have gotten in his way. So
yeah, no, those are actually a couple of my favorite stories from the book as well. And I tried, other than the preface, I didn't insert myself too much into the main narrative in the book, and I made an exception with that paragraph you were mentioning there, Vincent. I'm actually really glad you noticed it and then it jumped out at you, because I wrestled about with myself about whether to include that or not. But it's especially poignant, I think, as we're entering December and getting ready for these long winter months, and we can still see the hot summers that we had in the rear view. Like I said, I grew up on a farm, and was actively, as was the rest of my family, actively involved in caring for that place. One of the biggest tasks on our farm every year is getting up the hay crop. And that's very weather dependent. The way we do it, it's very labor intensive. We still do small square bales on our farm that we haul by hand, stack in the barn by hand. And so, as Vincent was mentioning, I describe an experience where, and this has happened many, many times, but the time I'm reflecting on in particular, it just gave me this kind of profound sense of spiritual contentment. I describe this process of hauling hay in the summer, putting that hay up, and it's really hard, hot, itchy work. And then I write about being in the barn on a cold winter day and looking at all of the hard work that had happened to make the hay crop materialize right behind me in the loft that day, and then grabbing those bales individually and tossing them down to our cattle on our farm. We have a small 75-acre farm with about 25 or so cows, and watching those animals eat, and knowing that because of your hard work months before, in a totally different season, that animals that are in your care are full and warm, and one could imagine or hope happy. And so I had a conversation with a farmer I interviewed, and he was telling me about his process of getting up the hay and feeding in the winter, and it really struck a chord with me, and I wanted to share my own kind of experience there. And another related farming story that Vincent asked about, I interviewed a man named Samuel, and we were talking about these ideas of affection for place, this idea of love for the land. I describe these concepts not as emotions, which are often fleeting and they go away over time, but instead I describe them as virtues, or these character dispositions that we learn over time, that we earn and understand through habit, not like a static habit, something like tapping our toes during a song, but something that we habituate ourselves towards doing and practice over and over again. So Samuel and I were talking, and I should mention too, Samuel is a pseudonym. Every name in the book is a pseudonym. I didn't share people's real names in the book, but Samuel is a pseudonym. So he and I were talking, and we were talking about love for place, and he mentioned having his children and sometimes grandchildren coming out and working on the farm with him. And sometimes they were too small, or maybe didn't have the skills developed enough to actually help. And really, they were out building a fence or putting up a crop or whatever it was. And these kids were getting in the way, and they were probably slowing down the work. And Samuel recognized that, but he also recognized how important it is to teach the next generation how to practice both the science and the art of farming, and also to teach this love for place, which is really developed through repetitive experiences of connecting with and caring for the land. And so, when he shared that with me, it really resonated, because I had been that child getting in the way, working with family out in the field or in the barn. Wendell Berry, who's a huge influence on me, and his work really shapes this book. He's written about that quite a lot. And so I think those moments, which a lot of folks may just look at as a fleeting moment, are really important for instilling these sorts of virtues.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to these three qualities which you describe as virtues rather than emotions and sort of practices in some way. Um, I was struck. So affection and fidelity are their application to persistence in place is intuitive. I was struck by the use of the word imagination, which I really liked, but also by the definition, which I have to search for here in order to get it right. You called it the intimate and evolving understanding of, familiarity with, and attunement to a specific place. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit, because I think it's a really important concept. Um, it also applies, I mean, Patagonia, in my experience in working is with industrial companies with deep supply chains. But that idea of imagination is really important for any work that involves efforts of sustainability, because that's what we're trying to overcome, is a closure of the mind to alternatives. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and its application to both to farming and to rural life.
Yeah, absolutely. So Vincent mentioned these three connected ideas of imagination, affection, and fidelity. And I write about those, especially kind of from a somewhat philosophical sense in the first chapter. And the one that I spend the most time on, as Vincent mentioned, is this virtue of imagination. And I think it's because it is often misunderstood. You know, oftentimes we hear the word imagination in a conversation and our minds immediately jump to magical forests with talking animals and dancing unicorns and rainbows and all of these different like fantastical, unreal images. And the way Wendell Berry writes about imagination and the way I write about it as well is quite the opposite of that. You know, instead of being something otherworldly, imagination is deeply aware and attuned to reality and attuned to place. And in some ways, it is the most intimate form of knowledge that I think we can have in terms of the environment. I actually think, you know, a lot of the times we speak of indigenous communities, and traditional environmental knowledge is a term that often gets thrown out. And I think imagination is really similar to that, because it is an understanding and an awareness of place that is honed through experience. Imagination is not something that you can really glean or gather from a textbook or from watching a documentary or a webinar. It is a knowledge that is very place-based. And I think it goes beyond knowledge and also connotes this idea of connection. So it is this understanding rooted in your tie to a specific place that maybe you've learned from others who've come before you. Maybe you've also honed and developed yourself. And I really do think that that sort of imagination is the foundation of good stewardship. One, because I think imagination of that sort, as I write about in the book, leads to affection, and that love leads to fidelity. We can think in some ways, like a human-focused example of friendship. Friends are people who we know really well. We've spent a lot of time with them. We've developed a connection with them. We understand them. Because of that understanding, that relationship, that connection, we feel this sense of love for our friends. That love is enduring. And then because we have this love, we want to see them do well. And we're willing sometimes to sacrifice our own well-being to see a friend thrive and succeed. I think the same is true with imagination of place. And towards your point as well, Vincent, about kind of needing imagination for good stewardship, I'm excited that regenerative agriculture is getting to be a popular phrase nowadays. It's become sexy, especially as we think about climate issues and all these sorts of things. What I worry about with regenerative agriculture is that it's going to lose its sense of imagination in the sense that I've described. a lot of the times we talk about regenerative agriculture and people are going to say, okay, you should do cover crops, you should reduce tilling, make sure to practice rotational grazing and limit your input reduction, all of these different things. And those are important, right? Those are kind of generally some pretty good concepts to follow. But imagination would say instead, okay, let's look at this specific place in this specific community with these specific needs and these specific people. What does this land need? What does this community need? How can we make sure that we're caring for this place, which includes the land and the people, while also using good practices that are going to be financially responsible, ecologically responsible? How can we really make this a truly regenerative, life-giving system and not just some list of practices that we follow because someone in some faraway lab or office told us that's what we should do. Instead, we're listening to the land and doing what it needs. So I think imagination is essential for a lot of reasons, including that one.
I think you've raised a really major point. And it's, we worked, Patagonia has a small food company, and we worked with Rodale and Dr. Bronner's on a regenerative organic standard. And one of the things we found right away was, aside from building soil health, which was paramount, you could not establish a soil health without thinking about the health of the community and thinking about higher standards for animal welfare. So your point is really well taken from our experience. I was hoping you might talk a little bit about what the farmers are encountering, those who want a persistent place, and what the resistance is from the existing systems. And you talk about you really look closely in the book at 2 counties, and particularly in the first county, they're just heavy pressures for development housing, because there's near Spring Hill, there's an automotive factory and people coming in for industrial jobs. And then you also talk about the temptation for selling out when the land prices increase that way. But also this idea of, which is really infected, it's a very strange idea, but get big or get out, which is kind of the antithesis of family farming. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, happily. Would be glad to. Yeah, so the whole basis of the book, or one of the major bases of the book, is trying to identify these virtues that we were just discussing, like in action. Like, if these all work on paper, this is great, it all makes sense in a book, but how is this actually playing out on the ground? And to do that, I wanted to use ethnographic research and go kind of immerse myself in a community and talk not to 1, 2, 5, or 10 people, but dozens of people, and really understand this place. And I wanted to do that in communities that were facing a lot of challenges, because it is easy in some ways to be virtuous if you're not facing any resistance, right? It's easy to be honest if you're not facing any pushback on these. So I wanted to talk to people who were loving their land and practicing fidelity to it in the face of tremendous adversity. And it really, the types of adversity I wanted to look at were ever present in these 2 communities where I anchored my research. And the first, as you were describing, Vincent, is this idea of farmland conversion from development. In both of the counties where I anchored my work, and I anchored it in 2 Tennessee counties, both because I knew those places and felt like I could really empathize and talk with the people who live there because I grew up in a similar place, but also because they were experiencing these challenges acutely. These are 2 counties that are right outside of Nashville. Nashville is one of the biggest booming cities in the country right now, and has been for the last decade or so. So the counties around it are feeling a lot of sprawl pressure. Some of these counties have lost tens of thousands of acres of agricultural land over the last couple decades to subdivisions and strip malls and these sorts of things that have really, we talk about gentrification a lot in an urban setting, but these counties and communities have really experienced a rural gentrification of sorts. And all of this happening, as I mentioned, within Tennessee, which is one of the most threatened states in the nation for farmland conversion. American Farmland Trust, where I work, actually has released some reports showing that over the next 20 years, Tennessee alone is projected, if recent trends continue, to convert or compromise over 1 million acres of agricultural land, which is nearly 10% of all the farmland in this state. And these counties definitely toward the top of that list in terms of that conversion. And so there are economic challenges that face agrarian communities when that type of conversion happens. There's all sorts of environmental challenges associated with sprawl and unplanned kind of haphazard development. There are ecological challenges, all sorts of different things that really can bring harm if we don't grow and develop in thoughtful ways. There are also emotional challenges. And when I spoke with the farmers that I did about this issue, they spoke about their place and its evolution and its change in really powerful terms. Some folks who are really stoic, often quiet people, actually broke down on the phone with me or in conversation with me and really, began crying, thinking about how difficult it is to see their neighbors and their friends and their family members kind of displaced by a form of rural gentrification. And so that was really difficult to see that. It's also difficult for a lot of these farmers to resist converting their own lands because of the prices that they're being offered, usually unsolicited. So some of the people I spoke with, let's just say they're on a 100-acre farm, being offered $20,000 and $30,000 and $40,000 an acre for their land, money that would make them instant millionaires. And you can see that temptation being really real. A lot of the people I spoke with said they've turned those offers down without hesitation because the money doesn't mean as much to them as their connection with the land. So I really thought that was powerful in the face of that form of adversity. And then in terms of kind of the get big or get out or the agricultural consolidation question, across the board, no matter what metric or statistic you look at, the data is really, really clear that consolidation has been happening in American agriculture for decades, and it continues to get, at least in my view, it continues to get worse. And so, that has its own economic and environmental and social consequences as well. But when you look at these two challenges side by side, you've got, government or private economic forces saying, you're not worth anything if you're not farming thousands of acres and you're not heavily capitalized and you don't have millions of dollars invested in your equipment. If you're just farming your 100 acres, your 50 acres, whatever it may be, you're not, you should just quit. Like either maximize your scale and amplify your production or just give up. We don't want to deal with all these sorts of things. And I talk about several examples of that. And then on the flip side, you've got people saying, well, we really, agriculture is not the highest and best use of this land. We could get more money if we turn it into subdivisions or strip malls. And that's really what we should do. So why don't you just quit farming and you can sell your land for something that's actually useful and productive, such as new housing developments or new commercial centers. So either way, these smaller and mid-sized farmers who are trying to continue caring for their land are feeling that pressure and really being squeezed from both sides. I think we'll talk about this later on, and Indy mentioned it in her introduction, but farmers of color are dealing with those issues and then also dealing with the systemic injustices of racism in agriculture, which is, very much has happened in the past, but is also really still alive in the present. So you've got all these people who are trying to persist and persevere, but are having a hard time doing it because of all of these systemic challenges that we have, as a society kind of put on these communities. So the fact that any of these smaller scale farmers, these mid-sized farmers are still persisting speaks volumes to their love for place and their desire to remain in it.
Yeah, thanks. It was, to the issue of Black farmers that you interviewed. There's also, I mean, you talked about a special pressure of inheritance, and it really struck me how far we've come from the tradition of subsistence farming that was critical to families until about 120 years ago, and how that becomes almost impossible to continue when part of farming involves the ability to pay for lawyers.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And so Vincent's kind of referencing one of these challenges that I talk about, that it can really affect anyone. It especially affects people who are lower income, who don't have the resources to do things like estate planning, and hiring these attorneys for estate planning. That is a problem that has especially affected Black farmers in the South. And it's really pervasive. So these Black farmers and farmers of color have faced loan denials and delayed loans. They've faced underrepresentation on local agricultural committees. They've faced straight up racism from USDA and others, as well as all these forms of individualized prejudice. One systemic challenge that has really affected their ability to continue to own land and own their farms is something called Heirs Property. It's Heirs. I know I have a bit of an accent, so sometimes it helps to spell things out. And heirs property at its simplest form is when someone owns land and they pass away and they don't have a legally valid will. So ownership flows down equally to all of that person's heirs. And if the heirs don't immediately settle that estate, which can also be a costly process, that land will remain owned in what's called an heirs property format until the title issue is resolved. And there's nothing inherently, or shouldn't be anything inherently wrong with co-owning land with family members, right? A lot of people find strength in that, find power in that. But there are inadequacies in the law that create loopholes that can effectively dispossess people of their land really quickly and really easily. So let's say there are 50 co-owners of an heirs property owned land. It only takes, under traditional property law, it only takes one of those co-heirs, those co-tenants, to force a sale of the entire property, which most often gets done at public auction, which most often yields pennies on the dollar for what a family could get if they were to actually put their property on the free market. So you could have 49 of those people wanting to keep the family farm, wanting to let someone in their family go farm it and take care of it, but one person wants to sell it, and that happens. There are also numerous instances across the South and in other communities, actually in indigenous communities and communities along the US-Mexico border as well, where developers will buy one share of heirs property owned land from someone. They'll approach someone who might be on hard economic times and say, hey, I know you have this stake of ownership in family land. I tell you what, I'll give you $5,000 right now for your ownership stake. And that person may have never seen $5,000 in their life. And so they think it's a great deal. They take it. That person becomes a co-owner of the land. They force the sale at public auction. They buy all of the remaining shares at pennies on the dollar. They are now the free and clear owner of this land, and then they convert it or develop it or whatever it may be. The family's lost their land and they've gotten very little in compensation for it. So it's a really egregious injustice that has dispossessed a lot of people of color from their homes and from their homelands. And actually the USDA calls heirs property exploitation the leading cause of involuntary Black land loss across the country. So it is something that is really pervasive. It's something that a couple of farmers I spoke with in the book are actively dealing with themselves. And it's something that we really need to address. And more states are starting to address it. We need to make sure that those farmers have the support they need to properly plan for the future of their land so that, you know, their family can either maximize their economic benefit from it or hang on to that land if that's something they would like to do.
Right. Thank you. I think this is a good place, and we want to move on to questions and engagement with the audience pretty soon. But I'd like to ask you, because you close the book with a chapter on recommendations you make to the farm bill and to other practices that could, or to other policies that could alter or change or encourage make it easier for farmers who want to persist in place.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to make these virtues of affection and fidelity assets that really enrich and empower people, as opposed to liabilities that demand constant sacrifice. And so I outline a few different things that we can do at the federal, the state, and the local levels. You know, kind of starting at the federal level. There are a bunch of different things we could do. We could adjust or end a lot of the subsidies that have driven us towards a more industrialized agricultural system across the country. We could, one thing that stands out in particular and was actually introduced just a few months ago in Congress. I don't know if it'll happen or not. For some reason, it got pitched as a partisan issue, and it's not a partisan issue at all. There was a bill that I pushed for in the book called the Office of Small Farms Establishment Act. So this legislation would create a specific Office of Small Farms within the USDA to make sure that smaller scale farms, especially those that are, I believe they set it at 180 acres and smaller, are getting equitable access to some of the same programs that a lot of larger scale farms are the ones taking advantage of. So we can make sure that tax dollars that we're paying as citizens are going to folks who actually need the support instead of flowing directly to some of the largest and wealthiest farmers in the country. And so that's one thing I really believe in at the federal level. At the state level, you know, I think that states could pass amendments and adjustments to Heirs Property law. There is a bill that is being passed. It's being promoted by the Uniform Law Commission called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. A lot of states throughout the South and throughout other parts of the country have passed that legislation. I think every state should be working to pass that legislation. I'd also say that the battle is not over once that legislation is passed. There's more that we need to be doing grassroots work to support people in maintaining their landowning legacy, their heritage, whatever it may be, their connection to place. So, but that piece of legislation is a really good place to start. I think states should invest more in permanent land conservation funding and then help those dollars flow to lower income or working class families who would really like to see their land protected. They could do that with a purchased conservation easement instead of having to donate it and get no financial benefit. So they could be compensated for that. That would also lower the resale value of the land because the land would be permanently protected. It could only be a farm, which is going to facilitate land access for a next generation of farmers who have a hard time, like myself, competing with subdivision developers and other folks. So that it actually eases the land access transition. And then at the local level, I'll just be really quick. I think one thing that we could do better is effectively plan for agriculture. A lot of the times we think about comprehensive plans and development plans. And what those typically do is say where development should go. And, you know, agricultural land is just a placeholder until something better comes along. And I don't think that's true. So I think we could plan for the areas where we want to maintain a vibrant agrarian economy and culture and really support those areas. Not only do land use planning, but economic and development planning that supports these smaller scale farmers. Education planning that makes sure that the next generation realizes, hey, you know, farming is something that is really important. And it's something that's difficult and be a challenge and something they might like to do if we can remove some of these systemic barriers to make it a more economically viable vocation. So I could talk for days about all the things we could do, Vincent, but I will resist that urge because I'm really excited about some of the questions that are coming in through the chat.
All right. I just want to offer just a brief statement that I think that having a healthy rural economy and having healthy farms in terms of the practices on the farms is absolutely critical to the health of our air, our water, and the future of biodiversity, the future of human beings' ability to survive in our home place. So all of the points you raise, I think, are really critical. So let's open it up for questions. I think Heather's going to be helping us out with this.
Yes, I am. First of all, I'm loving all the amazing conversation in the chat. Thank you all for, your beautiful thoughts. So appreciate that. Any questions, put them in the Q&A, where you can then upvote your favorite question to be asked. So I'm going to start with a question from Lauren Ashbrook. I'd love to hear more about your fieldwork, Brooks. How did you build such relationships of trust with the farmers you interviewed? It's tricky to get people to open up about affection, commitment, and certainly their finances.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Lauren. It was I felt like it was important when I was choosing the place where I was going to do my work that it be a place that I knew and that I could really understand, as I mentioned earlier in response to one of Vincent's questions, a place where I could really truly empathize with people. And I grew up in that same sort of farming community that I embedded myself in for the research. And so, I think there can be a tendency in qualitative research to stick to an interview script or to ask questions using surveys and all of these things. And that's really important. That's great. I think in a lot of my conversations, I tried to remove that perception of me as some researcher coming in to extract information from these people that I spoke with, and instead just really tried to make it a conversation. Cracking jokes about how John Deere tractors are inferior to other brands, or talking about favorite breeds of cattle, or experiences raising crops that my family had grown up with that they're still raising today. Being able to have those genuine connections with people, I think, is what yielded that sense of trust. And it is really hard to discuss these big issues. And I'm very, very grateful that the farmers I spoke with were trusting enough of me and believed in this work enough to one, speak with me in the first place, and then when they spoke with me, actually open up and be really honest and share some raw, often very powerful reflections with me. So, it was really a pleasure to get to feel like I was doing this research in a place that is, in many ways, is my home.
Great. This one comes from Emily Parrish. Have you spoken to or considered speaking to a landowner who recently purchased a small farm? It would be interesting to see what type of motivation or land ethic the new owners have in comparison to a multi-generational farmer.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And I did actually, in the book, I spoke with a few people who had moved to their land relatively recently. And what's fun and interesting about that is that you can see those virtues of imagination, affection, taking root, right? They may not be as established yet as someone who's on a multi-generational farm, but you can see people starting to learn about their land and to really understand it in a really intimate, personal way. And so I do think there are some differences, obviously, between someone who grew up on a piece of property and then has returned to that land and has that decades long sometimes experience. But I think it can be a really formative process to cultivate those virtues anew in your own place, independent of some of those other legacies. It's actually something that I'm hoping to do myself here in the next couple of years. My wife and I are looking to try to get on a farm of our own here in the next 2 to 3 years. And it's going to be different because I know my family's land so well, and I've got an endless amount of stories, both mine and other family members that I've heard and have been passed down about that place. And so connecting with a new place is going It's going to be exciting. It's a little bit scary. Learning to care for that place in a way that might be different from the way that I learned to care for my own family's land. But I think I think it can be powerful to start developing those virtues. And I should mention too, and I alluded to this earlier, and this is a bit of a pivot to this answer, but I think we can develop those virtues of imagination and affection and relationships with place, not only in agricultural settings. So most people in the US are not farmers. I think we're down to like 2 million farms in the US, which is down significantly from where we were just a few decades ago. And I have my own concerns about that and think that we need lots and lots more smaller scale farmers. But you know, most people are going to live in cities and suburbs and towns. And I'm not actually encouraging a back to the land movement. I think it could be detrimental and destructive, at least as it is traditionally envisioned, where everyone leaves the city and goes out on their small plot of land and tries to farm and do all of these different things. One, because farming is a science and an art that takes time to learn. And if we just pushed everyone out there, I think that there would be ecological destruction from not being able to tend those soils well, not being able to tend animals well, but also economic ruin for a lot of people who might be depending upon a vocation in which they don't have any training in. So I'm not encouraging that back to the land movement. But what I think we can do is work to develop these senses of imagination, affection, fidelity, where we already are. And in a city, that might be an urban park. It might be a community garden. It might be a backyard. It might be a street tree that you walk by on the sidewalk every day to work. And if we can start paying attention to those places and trying to understand them, and cultivate at least some sense of love for these places, I think we'll better care not only for those specific places, but also by collective stewardship. You know, if we're all caring better for individual places, we'll care better for our communities, for our states, for our country, for our planet. I really think that some of the most important work that we can do to address these huge challenges of climate change, of species extinction, deforestation, agricultural industrialization starts in specific places. And then if we can expand that momentum out, I think we'll lead to better stewardship for all of us. So I know that was a bit of diversion from the original question, but it was on my mind. I wanted to get it out there.
That's great. Thanks, Brooks. Another is about your experience at Yale. You know, what was your experience as someone with a rural farming background at a place like Yale? What was that like? And it's basically, it seems like the prevailing sentiment and potentially environmental and an Ivy League community towards farmers could be negative at times. What was your experience?
Yeah, I had to, in interviews and conversations, I had to really throw out my street cred or my dirt road cred or field cred or whatever in some of these conversations. Like, hey, I know I'm coming from this institution, and people often have their perceptions of that, but like I grew up in tobacco patches and cattle fields and hay fields. So like, hey, we're talking the same language here. And so I had to kind of emphasize that on occasion. But I will say I had a tremendous experience at the School of the Environment at Yale. And I had people who were genuinely interested in learning about my background, coming from a rural community, coming from a farming family, and really wanted to understand and talk about it. And I didn't, this could sound funny, but when I was getting ready for graduate school, I didn't expect to really make any friends. And that's not because I'm not like a person who enjoys making new friends. I really do. But I'd always been told you treat graduate school like a job. You go in, you do your coursework, you do your research, and you get out. And that was not my experience at Yale. Some of my closest friends, some of my most trusted mentors came from that experience of attending school there. And so I'm really grateful for that experience, because I have been in other settings where I speak with the accent that I have and share the background that defines who I am. And people aren't that keen to listen anymore. I've experienced some, even people thinking they were giving compliments, saying like, oh, you know, I've never heard someone who sounds like you and comes from where you come from really sound that intelligent and on top of these issues before. And I think they shared it as a compliment, but it was extremely offensive and hurtful. This is kind of on head. I just finished last night, actually, Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead. A phenomenal book for anyone who gets a chance to read it. And she's actually writing about the way that some people look at rural communities, whether it's in Appalachia or elsewhere, as backward, and they don't know enough. And that's just wrong. Knowledge is different, but it doesn't mean it's lesser than. And so I actually, when I was at Yale, at least in the circles that I was in and in the school of the environment, the knowledge that I had from my personal experiences was valued and appreciated and uplifted by professors and by friends. And I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. We have another question, and I keep them coming and keep upvoting. This one's from Andrew Barenberg. Hey, Brooks, curious what role you think, or your research revealed, the development of local and regional food systems can play in supporting the farmers you focus on. In other words, creating more place-based markets for their products and the most effective ways to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and Andrew and I have actually had these conversations offline. So yeah, I'm really glad that he raised that topic. Yeah, I think it's important for a lot of reasons. One, because I think it can create better economic outcomes for a lot of these local farmers if we can tap into local and regional food systems. These communities that I talked about being outside of Nashville, as development is currently happening, Nashville is in many ways a threat to these rural communities. But if we can be smart and intentional about how growth happens, Nashville could actually be a huge boon for these rural communities that are on its outskirts, because they can grow the products that can't be grown in the city, and can actually have a rural-urban economic partnership there, because there are things in the urban communities that rural communities don't have and that they need. So there are real ways that we can partner together. I never want to set up the false dichotomy that rural and urban communities are against each other. They are completely dependent upon each other. And if we can realize that and support that, I think we'll be much better off. But one other thing I'll mention on the local and regional food system front, I mentioned I grew up on a small scale cattle farm in Tennessee. We raised several other things, but we'd always had cows. Rotational grazing, really, really thoughtful about the way we stewarded our land with the animals, and they were a very strategic and integrated part of our system. In a local and regional food system, the beef that's raised on a farm like that is going to stay within that community. In a more industrialized, efficient system, we're going to raise that cow in Middle Tennessee till it gets to be a certain weight, and then it's going to get sold at an auction, shipped to Oklahoma or Kansas or Nebraska, fed out for a few months, and then shipped back in plastic to Tennessee to be sold in a grocery store. And we're all going to talk about how efficient that is. It's not very efficient, and it's really bad for climate issues, because we've got all these transportation costs, we've got all these other things. And if we can keep our food that we're raising in our own local communities, one, we're going to have different regional flavors and local flavors and all these other really fantastic things that a lot of restaurants are really starting to embrace and lean into now. But we're going to start to limit some of those climate and environmental issues as well, if we can really, truly, genuinely embrace a more localized food system.
This might be our last one, and then I'll let Vincent wrap it up, but I thought it'd be a nice way to end. So Brooks, how did you decide you wanted to write a book about this? And what did that process look like? I mean, going from an idea to getting a book published is a huge feat.
Yeah, it took a lot of time and a lot of work. I think, and I'll try to be brief in my answer. In some ways, writing feels like a vocational calling for me, to be able to share these stories, share my thoughts, my own unique experiences, and uplift the experiences of others, especially those whose experiences, as I was referencing a little earlier, may not be as valued societally as they should be. So I think I came to write this book to share those stories and to reference those experiences that I was talking about in my opening response, about growing up in a community like this, about engaging with farmers and communities like this. And I just felt really called to share those stories, and to uplift the work of folks like not only Wendell Berry, who I said has been an influence on me, but people like Bell Hooks. A lot of people don't think of Bell Hooks as an agrarian or an agrarian writer. And if you read some of her work, especially Belonging, A Culture of Place, it's really been a formative book for me. You can see how she is writing as an agrarian who's really committed to place, and also wrestling with these other challenges of race and gender and other aspects. But I wanted to try to lift those things up. And really, it was a fun process for me. It was a ton of work. It's still a ton of work. You think you write the book, you get it, and you hold it in your hand. You're like, oh, I'm done. And then you realize, man, now I got to promote the thing and get people to buy it and all this sort of stuff. But it's been a fun process, and I feel really lucky that I got to do it. And I'm looking forward to the next one, whatever that book may be.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brooks, for writing the book. And also, you mentioned, and I think it's really critical, that the virtues that you talk about of imagination, affection, and fidelity are useful for all of us. And a sense of a connection to a sense of place is absolutely essential for all of us. We can't really save our world if we don't know it, if we don't know what it is, and if we don't care about it. We've had a 50 to 75 year experiment of globalization, and we need to rekindle this connection to where we live and the interdependence we have with nature and with each other. So thanks so much. And thanks everyone. Thanks CBEY, and thanks all the participants for your wonderful questions.
Thank you all.